All right, welcome to the Lion's Den Academy here, where we do verse by verse, in-depth, engaging Bible study. And in today's video, we're going to be continuing our study on the book of Matthew. I believe this is the 20th video in that series so far. And specifically, we're going to be covering chapter 5, verses 38 to 42, where Jesus interprets the law of retribution. So with that being said, before we break this down bit by bit, as we always do, let's go over all these verses here as a whole. So it goes, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." So this passage here, it's definitely up there with some of the most commonly misinterpreted passages in the Bible. And whenever that happens, it's always due to people taking that out of context. So in the case of these verses here, some have misinterpreted them to promote pacifism and to say that pretty much Christians should just be a walking doormat. And even some have taken it so far as to be a conscientious objector to military service. In fact, the entire thesis of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace revolves around this exact misinterpretation of this passage. I know most of us haven't read that very long book, but in it, Tolstoy uses this passage here to advocate for the abolition of police and the military and pretty much all forms of authority, as well as eliminating all punishment for crimes, since Jesus tells us not to resist evil. So as with all scripture, though, we need to make sure that we understand the full context in order to properly interpret it and apply it. And in this passage specifically, the context and the contrast that Jesus has been showing between true righteousness and self-righteousness, just like in the previous verses that we've been studying, he's not giving new commandments here per se, but instead he's showing the character of someone that has a changed heart, and he's emphasizing the spirit of the law that had become lost through tradition. So with that being said, let's start breaking this down bit by bit here. So it starts with, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." So what Jesus is referring to here is what's called lex talionis, which that was the law of retaliation or revenge. Now, this might sound somewhat barbaric, but it did serve as a means to not only ensure that justice was actually obtained, but it also limited the punishment to match, but never exceed, the harm or injury suffered from the crime. We can actually trace lex talionis back as far as the Code of Hammurabi, even which tells us that this was a system that was in place well before 18th century BC, when Hammurabi had them codified and preserved on a pillar. Additionally, though, the Old Testament actually incorporates lex talionis as well, and in Deuteronomy 19:21, it says, "Your eyes shall not pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot." Similar passages are also found in Exodus 21:23 to 25, and Leviticus 24:19 to 20 as well. This did change a bit over time, however, in Israel, and the law was actually modified so that the injured person could receive an appropriate sum of money instead of repaying the offense for some sort of physical injury or something like that in order to receive justice. Now, as we've seen quite a bit throughout the Sermon on the Mount, while Jesus is talking and preaching to everyone both then and now, he also tends to specifically call out the Pharisees and scribes in regards to how that they have handled the interpretation and practice of the law. And he's doing that here as well. You see, they had twisted the law to mean that if someone offends you or cause you, an injury or injustice, that you were not only allowed to take the appropriate revenge on them, but that you were pretty much obligated and required to do so, which essentially turned, a restriction on revenge into a requirement to get retaliation. They also held so tightly to this that they would actually think it was better to quickly take matters into their own hands and get justice for themselves, rather than refer the matter to any sort of judicial proceeding. Now, the next verse, though, it starts with, "But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil." So this principle here is one that a large number of zealous Jewish individuals, they wouldn't have received this phrase very openly or eagerly, since they were actually seeking a way to expel the Roman occupation by force. It's also a phrase here that those with the complete pacifism interpretation, like Tolstoy, they've used this to support their argument as well. However, Jesus isn't saying that we shouldn't police ourselves or ever get justice. Instead, he's advocating for Christians as individuals not to seek out vigilante justice. So now, depending upon your translation of this passage, Jesus either says, "Resist not him who is evil," or "resist not evil." And the ambiguity of the grammar, that it makes it unclear as to whether Jesus is telling us to resist a specific person, which could either be Satan or simply a person that is causing you injury, or if we should instead resist the principle of evil. Fortunately, though, by examining the examples that Jesus gives us next on how to respond when someone strikes us, when they sue us, when they force us to go a mile, or when they beg from us, we can kind of get a better understanding of what he's really telling us here. So we can also get even more of a better understanding by also looking at some other verses that kind of touch on this topic as well. For example, it's unlikely that he was actually referring to Satan, since elsewhere in the Bible, such as like James 4:7-9 and 1 Peter 5:9, we're told specifically to resist the devil. It's also quite likely that it's not telling us not to resist evil itself, since throughout the New Testament we see countless examples of both Jesus and his disciples resisting evil by all means possible, to include flipping tables and whipping the people that turned God's house into a money den. The New Testament also gives us instruction on how to handle a person that refuses to repent later in Matthew 18, which we've kind of gone over in some other videos we've done as well. I covered that on the video I did on divorce and stuff. But then even later in 1 Timothy 5:20, we are also told to rebuke sin publicly or in the presence of all, so that the rest may be fearful of sinning. So that being said, with all the additional context on this topic that these verses provide us that we just went over, the Bible makes it pretty clear that individuals and the church, and really even the government, even though we didn't go over those passages specifically, but they are in the Bible, and they don't really pertain to how we can apply today's passage to our lives. So decided to kind of skip over those, but the verses show us that we can and we should resist actual evil. So if that's the case, then the real question is, what does Jesus mean here when he says that we shouldn't resist evil? So as with all my videos I've done, I'm never implying that I have everything correct. I'm simply teaching you the insights and conclusions that I found and come to with the study and the research that I've done. And if any of you feel I have anything wrong, then please, I want to know if I'm wrong. So please feel free to reach out. I'm always open to learn if I've taken anything out of context here. But with that being said, from my studies, I believe that Jesus is really trying to address 2 points here. And we can kind of clearly see this through the examples that he's about to give. So the first point is that he's addressing the Pharisees and scribes specifically to tell them that their approach of interpreting lex talionis, so that it obligated you to take matters into your own hands and avenge the wrongdoing against you, which, like I said, it turns a means of ensuring justice was received and not excessive. They kind of turn that into a free ticket for vigilante justice. Secondly, Jesus is also trying to teach us what the model behavior of a saved person with a changed heart should look like when we are treated poorly and insulted in a variety of different circumstances. It should also be noted too, though, that based on the examples that he gives, that they're pretty much only ones that a Christian would almost certainly encounter with someone that is not a Christian. So generally speaking, for example, right? We're talking about the specific examples. Someone that's a Christian, I would doubt that they're a Christian and they would actually be using physical violence or an insulting slap on anyone, let alone another Christian. And if they did, then that's kind of when you would want to follow the steps that we went over in Matthew 18 to resolve that dispute. Now, while we're going to dive deeper into the rest of these examples a bit, the one that he gives about being sued and someone taking your cloak, which that's a situation where the cloak is literally the only thing that they're able to take because you have nothing else to your name. And it would actually have to be returned by nightfall since you'd have nothing else to keep warm. Now, there might be some people that would call themselves a Christian and enforce that through a judge. I personally don't know anyone, though, that would sue someone for literally their shirt off their back to keep them warm. That's the only thing that can keep them warm when they don't have anything else, regardless of what that person might have done to them or taken from them. They would see that they're in that dire of a situation, and they would be doubtful to want to take anything from that person. And then the next example is talking about someone forcing you to go a mile with them, and then offering to go 2. Now we're going to talk more depth on that one as well, but that's specifically referring to a law that allowed Roman soldiers the free will to pretty much demand any Jewish person that they saw on the spot to carry their pack for them for up to a mile. Now during Jesus' walk on earth, there were very few and far between Romans that did believe in God. And of course, after the resurrection and the works of the apostles, and, we can kind of see in the book of Acts and stuff, that does begin to change rather rapidly. But in the context of when he's speaking this, you can almost be assured that, it's an unbelieving Roman that's asking a believer to carry their load for a mile. And the last example that this passage does provide, it's about freely giving. Of course, that's a bit more universal. Doesn't necessarily apply between a Christian and a non-Christian, although it definitely can. But it could also apply to a Christian and another Christian. But that being said, with all these mainly being directed at situations between a saved and unsaved person, I think that Jesus is also kind of showing how we can respond to these situations with love, peace, and a caring heart. To at the very least plant a seed in that unbeliever that could then flower into them coming into a relationship with Christ. So in Romans, Paul tells us, do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good. And which that's almost like the phrase, kill them with kindness. And Peter also tells us that, we shouldn't pay back evil for evil, or insult for insult, but on the contrary, we should give a blessing, since that's what it says we were called for this, so that we may also inherit a blessing by giving that blessing. All right, and so the next part of the passage here goes, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. Now, obviously, Jesus gives us 4 examples here to help us illustrate his message, but he certainly isn't limiting the scope of the message to just these 4 examples. This statement could easily be applied to a variety of different situations involving someone physically doing something to harm you and or insult you. But then again, I do want to be clear, there's absolutely certain circumstances in which, you simply would not turn the other cheek and take on additional abuse. For example, if someone stabs you or shoots you in the right leg, you're definitely not going to offer them your left leg for that, right? That's driving you to suffer, serious physical harm, potential death, and Jesus doesn't want that for you. God doesn't want that for you. This isn't something that should also be ever used as an excuse to try to stay in an abusive relationship where you and or possibly your kids are repeatedly subjected to physical harm as well. I do think that this, this particular passage here can apply to other physical harm or insults as well, such as a punch or a kick or a shove. But at the same time, it's kind of a bit of a gray area. Certain well-placed and strong punches can cause way more damage than a slap ever could. So the situation like that is going to cause for some form of self-defense, or even leaving the situation much more quickly than a slap or a shove ever would. So that being said, while a slap hardly ever leaves, actual physical harm done other than, a stinging cheek for a short period of time, the emotional pain and rage caused from the insulting gesture of a slap can easily infuriate a man into a state of rage faster than any punch or gesture could. So additionally, being slapped on the right cheek, that's more of an insult in those days. since it would imply that the person slapping you used their left hand, which was the hand that they would use to wipe themselves and clean their toilet, or they were using the backhand of the right hand. Both of those are way more insulting than just a regular slap. Now, while even today, a slap would likely start a fight, among the Jews during that time, a slap to the face was, viewed not as an attempt to cause any sort of physical harm, but was instead used as to show simply contempt for a person's character, and a sign of an extreme disrespect. It was actually viewed so negatively that a backhand slap was punishable by a very heavy fine, according to the Jewish Mishnah. But even Jewish slaves at that time, they actually would have been preferred being whipped than being slapped in the face. So it was being held, that it was that serious of an issue. So while it might be instinctual to want to escalate, or at the very least pay someone back blow for blow, Jesus here is calling us to be different and to take the insults and offenses patiently, and instead to trust God to defend us, and to let God himself enact his justice. And also hopefully use the situation as an example to what a peaceful Christian life looks like, and hopefully bring the other person to Christ as well. And as Paul tells us in Romans, it says, don't seek revenge yourself, but give place to God's wrath. For it is written, vengeance belongs to me, I will repay, says the Lord. And then, the next example and passage that we come to, it says, if anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. So here we come to the example that I briefly mentioned before. And just to recap, this is essentially, talking about a situation during that time of where someone could come and sue you for a wrongdoing, and if there was nothing else to your name, then someone could pretty much just sue you for your cloak. But under the Mosaic law, as explained in Exodus 22:26-27, as well as Deuteronomy 24:10-13, they would be required to give your cloak back before the sun went down, since that's the only thing that keeps you warm. Now, a tunic at that time, that was kind of like a shirt, but it was like a long robe and worn close to the skin, while the cloak was an outer garment that was essentially worn like a cloak. Worn like a coat, I mean. If you were to surrender both of these, it would essentially render you naked. And this might sound a bit extreme, but the point that Jesus is trying to make here is that, is that since someone's taking action to sue you, especially if they were going through all the rigmarole of the legal action to do so, knowing that there's not a dime to your name that they can collect from that, it's simply just going to inconvenience you for a period of time, then they must surely feel that they have been wronged by you. And the Christian response to that is by diffusing conflict and making peace as quickly and willingly and as possible, and yielding more than is even required legally to show that you are truly wanting to make things right, and that you value people and you value those relationships. A great example of this can actually be seen in the story of Richard Wurmbrand. He was a preacher that was imprisoned and tortured for years in Chinese communist camps. On recalling his experiences, he said, I've seen Christians in communist prisons with 50 pounds of chains on their feet, tortured with red-hot iron pokers, in whose throats spoonfuls of salt had been forced, being kept afterward without water, starving, whipped, suffering from cold, and praying with the fervor for the communist. Afterwards, the communists would come to prison too. And while the non-Christians beat them, the former torturers, the Christians actually took to their defense. I've seen Christians giving away their last slice of bread, and at that time they had one slice of bread a week, and the medicine that could literally save their lives to a sick communist torturer who is now a fellow prisoner. And then the last bit of, the next example, not the last one, it says, whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. So like I kind of briefly mentioned earlier, During the time of Jesus speaking these words, Judea was under Roman military occupation and under military law. And through that law, any Roman soldier had the right to force any Jew to carry his pack for up to 1 mile, but no further. Now, the actual Greek word used here is million, which literally translates to 1,000 paces. Now, a normal pace is actually around 3 feet, but the Romans instead approximately consider it 5 feet for whatever reason, which does make 1,000 paces close to a mile. Interestingly enough, though, while the word million is absolutely the correct word for this verse, since it directly refers to the statutes of the military law, referring to the amount of steps, the usual word for the mile found throughout the rest of the Bible is going to be stadion, if I'm pronouncing that correct. It is also due to this law, though, that Simon of Serene is required to carry Jesus' cross to his crucifixion. I know the book of John mentions that Jesus carried it, but all the other Gospels do mention that Simon of Serene was called to do this. I know you might think, carrying 20 to 40 pounds for a mile, that's not the worst thing ever, especially if you're somewhat reasonably fit. However, this can be quite an oppressive service, even if it doesn't seem that physically demanding. For one, you're being forced to carry the burden of someone who is an occupying nation, and that they're known for treating your people very, very poorly, and looking down upon your God, and in that situation, those would be the last people that you would typically just be inclined to help in any bit of way, especially if you're being forced to. And then secondly, just recall for a second the last time that you were held up for something that you needed to get to, whether it's an appointment, whether that's work. By anything, whether that's traffic when you're trying to get somewhere, or work, or even something more pressing, like maybe you're heading to a hospital and then your tire blows, something like that. Something gets in your way and throws you off course like that. Now imagine being in that situation. You're running late out of the house to go to work, and then an occupying soldier stops you by force and says, "Hey, carry my stuff." Right, and then it's quite possibly that the direction he's needing you to carry it is in the exact opposite direction of where you're needing to go. So that's pretty much just completely ruined your day and morning there, and your plans for what your schedule is going to look like. And then that being said too, that turns into a situation it's easily going to drive someone to anger and bitterness, and that's the exact opposite of what Jesus is calling us to do. And then there's also no guarantee that at the end of reaching your required obligated service, that another Roman soldier isn't going to see you and be like, "Hey, you're free now. Take my stuff." So and that might even be taking you further away from the direction that you're trying to go. So it's a pretty it's a pretty oppressing law that they were required to do. But Jesus, he's saying, hey, offer even more. And so hopefully with that additional context, you can see how hard that would be to not only suffer such an insult with a smile, but then also to seize the initiative by doing more than is even required of you. And essentially, Jesus is telling us to, hey, go the 1 mile that's required by law, and then freely give another mile out of love. And that, it enables us, actually, while it is oppressive and it's not what you would normally plan on doing or want to do, but it does enable us to turn an attempt to manipulate us into a free act of love. And while this is directly referring to the Roman military law that I mentioned, it also applies to situations where people nowadays need to be served. For example, let's say that someone, even if the person that isn't a close friend, but it's just let's say it's a neighbor or colleague, something like that, and they're asking for people to help them with something like moving, painting, something like that. These are situations that you can absolutely step up and not just go for the mile that they're asking for help with, but see what other needs there are and how else that you can serve them. And while serving others like this, it's absolutely fantastic. When we do this is really the best time to share God's word with them. By demonstrating love and compassion that is freely given and showing the heart of service, that is in Christians, you can impact and reach people that are far from God in a strong and powerful way. While this is talking about acts of just labor and service that you're offering, it kind of goes back to hey, like feed their bellies and then feed their souls. So you're meeting them at the need that they have. And then by meeting that need, you're opening that door to say, hey, like this is how a Christian is, and you're showing them by example, but then you're also communicating them the word to them, and just doing everything that you can to bring them to Christ. So that being said, let's go over the last bit of verse here today. It says, "Give to him who asks of you," and talks about freely lending and all that. So in this last example, he's really focusing on our hearts here and what we find important. So really the question it's asking us is whether we find the things that we own, which actually it's not even ours to begin with. Everything we have has been given to us by God, or if we find that serving people and serving God is more important. At the same time, though, while it's not expressly said, it is both implied and backed by other scripture that there are and there should be appropriate boundaries for this. For example, if someone asks you to give them your house and your car, I don't think that anyone would take this passage to mean that you should just give up a roof over your head and your only means of transportation simply because someone asked you for it, right? Now, although I suppose if you happen to own 5 houses and 11 cars, then that can absolutely be an amazing a way to just radically bless someone and show amazing generosity. But for the rest of us that aren't fabulously wealthy, then we certainly aren't required or called to do what we're not equipped to do. So that being said, if we balance this passage with other scripture, we do get a better understanding of exactly what that calling is. In Psalm 112 verse 5, it says, "Good will come to him who is generous and lends freely, who conducts his affairs with justice." And the word justice here, it's really referring to wisdom and discernment. So while we're absolutely called to be, generous and lend freely, we're also supposed to be wise in our judgment on when and how much we should give. And that's for really 3 reasons. One, sometimes it's better and more loving to refuse to give money to someone. Even the Bible tells us in 2 Thessalonians 3:10 that if a man will not work, he shall not eat. And obviously the key word here is will, not since that implies that he has the actual capacity to do so, yet he refuses to do it, right? So it's not saying if a man can't work, then he shall not eat. And this totally applies to people closest to us as well. While it might feel very unloving to refuse to support, for example, like a grown child that refuses to leave the house to go to college or get a job after high school, but instead wants to pass the day eating Cheetos and playing Xbox, we would actually be doing them a loving favor by helping them grow up and accept responsibility for their lives by refusing to support that behavior. The last thing we want to do is to actually encourage laziness, and by giving something to someone that they should be working for, if they actually have the capability to do so. Secondly, we should also use the judgment to see if what we're giving them is actually being used to fulfill a need and not simply encouraging bad behavior. And we should also try to determine what a person's actual need is and then meet that need if we are able. For example, if a stranger's asking you, for gas money or food, and that's their real need, then instead of just giving them money, then that they might spend on things that aren't really an actual necessity or anything like that. We can buy them food. We can have them bring their car up to the gas pump and swipe our card there so they can get fill up their car and stuff like that. And then thirdly, or lastly, while we are no doubt called to be radically generous, we are also called to be a good steward of what God has given us in another way, and that's providing for your family. And your giving shouldn't be to such an extent that jeopardizes that in any way. God, definitely blesses those who give, but he does want you to be a good steward of what you have. In 1 Timothy 5:8, the Bible tells us, but if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for members of his household, then he has denied the faith, and he is worse than an unbeliever. You see, it's almost like how, on airplanes we're told to, put on our mask before we help someone that isn't able to put on their own mask, such as a child. So that there's a fine line with that. Though while we should make sure that we're using sound financial principles and judgment when we're determining what we are capable of giving, so that we don't put ourselves or our family in a state of financial insecurity. We also need to look realistically at what our family's needs are, both current and future, ensure that they aren't wants that we are refusing to surrender in order to be generous. So let's take that example I gave, with the oxygen mask on the plane, for example. The instructions that they give, it's not to if the mask fall down, put the mask on, and then make sure that you've gotten your drinking meal from the stewardess, and then the onboard Wi-Fi is working before you help anyone that needs help with their mask, right? Likewise, we can easily find ourselves pushing off acts of giving until we've reached a certain point to where we feel that we have everything that we want, which is of course going to be a never-ending list. While you definitely want to make sure that you're saving for retirement and emergency expenses, and that you're not giving away money that you need to pay the bills with, at the same time, there are several things that we could easily forego and do without, and use those resources to give generously and bring people to Christ. I of course can't make those choices for you. But it's something that we should all really be thinking about and pray on, to see if there's anything that we're viewing as a need that's really a want that we could easily sacrifice. For example, and this is just one example, but maybe you're going through all your paid streaming services and stuff like that, and maybe you feel convicted that, hey, maybe I can get by with just Hulu, Disney Plus, and PureFlix, and maybe we'll cancel Netflix and use that money, each month to bless others. With that, though, we will wrap up today's study. There's only one more video left until we finally move on to chapter 6 of Matthew. I know there's been loads of information thrown at you over this small bit of the Bible that we've covered, but I really do hope that is helping you bring deeper into the Word and granting you greater understanding that lets you be closer to God. If you did enjoy this video, I would ask that you help YouTube push this content out to others. If you haven't, give this video a like. If you haven't subscribed, please feel free to do so if you feel that you'd want to watch more of these videos, because that's what this channel is all about. I'm just going over the Bible bit by bit like we just did. But on that note, I pray that God blesses you and keeps you, and I look forward to seeing you next time.